village. Sri Lanka cannot detach themselves from the power struggle in the world, and right now with the arms race accelerating and many countries gaining nuclear capabilities and maybe even going a little bit beyond that, the world is becoming a very small place. And Sri Lanka, as a country, where do we stand? Have we been able to maintain our sovereignty as a nation? Is Sri Lanka's diplomatic policy in the right place? To discuss these matters and more, we've got on our show this evening Nilanthan Niruthan. He is a defense analyst and, of course, a lecturer in international relations. A very good evening, Nilanthan, and welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Nilanthan, the biggest development in the global arena, as well as maybe making global headlines here in Sri Lanka as well, is the reports that China has now tested a hypersonic missile capable of carrying nuclear missiles or nuclear warheads. Nilanthan, now this has caused a stir across the world. However, China has denied these reports, saying that they were only testing a spacecraft. But now Japan has come forward and said that they are upping their air defense systems. America has said that their intelligence communities were not aware that China was testing some sort of this sort of nuclear technology. And also, these developments come against a backdrop where the tensions between Taiwan and China are also at a very high level. So before we get into Sri Lanka's part in this whole global drama that's playing out, at least right now, give us a little bit of background on what exactly is happening here.
Okay, right. So you've asked a complex question, so let's break that down into sort of individual sections. Now, in terms of the hypersonic missile issue, so for those who are watching who are a bit confused, a hypersonic missile is a missile that travels more than 5 times the speed of sound. That's what it is. And for a long time, people have considered this to be the next generation of technology when it comes to warfare. So people have been speaking about the emergence of hypersonic missiles for a long time. China, the United States, Russia, many of the leading military superpowers have been very, very heavily involved in this. Now, the reason, as you pointed out, this particular test has sparked so much international discussion, especially in a sort of global security sense, is, as you mentioned, the possibility of a nuclear payload on a hypersonic missile. Now, most countries around the world have specific procedures and defense mechanisms for the eventuality of a nuclear attack from another country. But the problem with hypersonic missiles is that the enemy might be able to attack us before our traditional responses kick in and before we can actually do something to respond. As you pointed out, China has vehemently denied this. But once again, Japan and many other countries which have already been working on this for a long, long time will, once again, as your question sort of suggested, will start ramping up production, ramping up research, and they've already publicly stated that they will do that. So what we are witnessing on the one hand is the start of, or the potential start of, a new type of arms race with China as the centerpiece, and what happened this week as the centerpiece. Now, moving to the larger issue in terms of what you touched on, which is the China-Taiwan rivalry. Now, once again, this has become such an important issue because, I can't remember the last time China-Taiwan relations were sort of described in such hostile terms, where we actually have members representing the ruling parties of both sides speaking in terms of war, where the Taiwanese Democratic Party is very openly speaking about the possibility of a Chinese invasion. And Beijing is also very clearly sort of articulating their own position in terms of, look, if you have all these American planes and American ships coming into the Taiwan Strait, then there will be a firmer response on our side than what you've seen before. So there are many, many layers to this. In terms of how the others fit in, it's still, I would say, a bit too soon for us to predict that because we are in a very unique stage in global geopolitics. This is just one man's opinion, by the way, but we're in quite a unique stage where we know that we are perhaps entering what we would call a post-pandemic world or whatever, even though even that term has become a cliche at this point. But we know that there's some sort of new era that we're entering, but it's too soon for us to predict how exactly it would work. It would be like trying to predict what a post-World War II world would have looked like in 1949 or 1950. It was too soon to tell where things were going. So similarly, we are in that unique stage, and there are many possibilities emerging. But China, as you rightly sort of pointed out, seems to be at the center of most of the recent debates. Let's put it that way.
Niruthan, you said that China is at the centerpiece of all of these global developments that are taking place. But even here in Sri Lanka, as far as local matters go, China also seems to be in the centerpiece of many of those developments as well, as far as the fertilizer crisis and many other investment projects also go. But Niruthan, just picking your mind on what Sri Lanka's role should be like or is like right now in this entire arms race. We see that the global players, the big players in the global arena, are looking at Sri Lanka, at what sort of opinion our government takes, even on issues such as the Palestinian-Israeli issue. And even the Taiwan-China issue. Who do we support? Who do we recognize? And even in the case of Afghanistan, will we be recognizing the Taliban government or not? From Sri Lanka's previous status, where maybe at certain times we were overlooked, the spotlight is on us right now because we're in the middle of a major trade route. The Belt and Road Initiative also runs through Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a crucial strategic position. So my question to you really is, what is Sri Lanka doing now? And next question would be, what should we be doing?
Right. So traditionally, the answer to your question in traditional Sri Lankan diplomacy has been that we need to maintain a non-aligned position, that we need to sort of be right down the middle, and we need to steer through many of those sort of courses. Now, my major concern, simply as a non-political defense and security analyst, as an academic, my major concern is whether that style of diplomacy will continue to work in the future. Because the one thing we know about the India-China rivalry, the USA-China rivalry, the way in which all three of these countries are able to sort of influence us in many invisible ways that are perhaps beyond our control at times, I've started to wonder whether our traditional style of non-aligned diplomacy will really be suited to navigate through this. However, it must be said that from the perspective of the existing diplomatic class, that still seems to be the prevailing consensus, that we need to continue with our non-aligned style, that we need to kind of make sure that, and it's one based on pragmatism, and I welcome that. I hope it works. But at the same time, when we sort of try to look at the way in which now the recent visits of Indian delegates to this country is a great example of that. We had both Jaishankar Menon coming at the beginning of the year, and we also had the foreign secretary who came a few weeks ago, and that clearly shows that even though this story of India and China competing over Sri Lanka is an old one, and even though we've been discussing this for a long time, there are always new twists and turns in that story. There are always new developments in that story. And right now, being non-aligned has worked, but will it continue to work as we move into the future? I'm rather skeptical about that.
But is Sri Lanka really as a country non-aligned? There were allegations from members of the opposition and some international analysts that Sri Lanka is following this tactic called hedging. We're hedging one country against the other. Is that really taking place, or are we really non-aligned?
I mean, non-aligned has always been code for hedging. That's always how non-aligned diplomacy has worked, unfortunately, where we sort of essentially say, you guys work it out, we're a third party, you're both our friends, and we will work with both of you. So that's been the typical norm of most, not just Sri Lanka, by the way, of most non-aligned countries. That's been their style of diplomacy over the last 50 years, and many of those countries are changing it sort of remains to be seen whether we will change as well, or whether we kind of retain our conventional style of engaging with the world.
Nilanthan, when you say that those countries are changing, what is this new style of diplomacy that they are adhering to now?
Picking sides is what I essentially mean. If you look at most countries in the region, and because most countries are, once again, they have certain luxuries that we don't. So we're an island, we're in, as you said, an important location on the world map. So we have many superpowers kind of vying for our influence, either through sort of seduction or coercion, however you want to put it. So in terms of picking sides, we do see, for example, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, many countries sort of now quite assertively going towards either China's side or the side of the United States, while we are one of those few countries remaining that still outwardly insists that we sort of that we are friends, that we're equal friends with everybody, that we have a non-aligned sort of policy. So many countries like Nepal, the Maldives, even Afghanistan now, even if a new Taliban government comes in, they will be forced to pick a side. They can't play a non-aligned game. So will we continue to do that? Maybe, maybe not.
So according to your analysis, Niruthan, I'm going to put you in a tough spot right now. If Sri Lanka reaches that eventuality, and I hope that we do not, because of course the non-aligned movement has made Sri Lanka a very influential player in the global arena. We saw even after the Second World War, the speech delivered by the Sri Lankan head of state had sway in the action that were taken against Japan and all of that. But coming to the eventuality where Sri Lanka will have to pick a side, according to your analysis, what are the pros and cons? Where do we turn to?
Okay, so our two real choices will be the Western Indian bloc or the Chinese bloc. Those are the only two real options that we would have if we ever had to pick a side, right? So on the Chinese side, there are a few advantages of dealing with them. Number one, based on past experience, their word is a lot more dependable because they do not have internal political factors and internal agents of chaos who make them go back on their word. So if we have diplomatic sort of assurances from China about something, there's a high probability that it will be seen through to the end by the Chinese. Whereas when we deal with more democratic countries, the problem is that often they will have local political complications, which means that their word to us might be something that they might have to backtrack on. So in that sense, China seems to be a more reliable partner. Also, China wants to do business. China is not here to tell us how we need to sort of conduct human rights, to tell us how we need to conduct counterterrorism. China views it much more as a business alliance rather than as an international responsibility. When we deal with democratic countries, especially bigger democratic countries who want to engage with us, the problem is that they then tend to start seeing it as their responsibility. They then start sort of having standards and their own sort of conditions that we need to abide by. So that's where China kind of wins through. However, in terms of cultural synergy, in terms of what the people here connect with, there's absolutely no doubt that people living in Sri Lanka have far more synergy with Indian sort of culture and even, in fact, Western culture than anything that the Chinese would do. And once again, these are invisible things that we miss. It might be easier for the people in power here to deal with the people in power in China. But ultimately, is it easier for the common man or woman here to deal with a common man or woman from India or from China? So those questions come in as well, which is what makes it a very complicated game. So ultimately, if we were thinking about dependability and reliability, it would be the Chinese. If we were actually going with whom we have more synergy with, which civilization do we have an actual connection with where we can grow together, India would win out on that. So it all depends on the public mood at that time. And this is something that just keeps oscillating from side to side.
Nilanthan, we will continue our discussion on this matter after this short commercial break. We've come to a very interesting point, and there is one more question that I would like to pose to you on this very same matter, but we will cross over to a commercial break first and be right back on the other side.
Newsfirst, Newsline. Newsfirst Newsline.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsline, and we're in discussion with a defense analyst and a lecturer on international relations, Nilanthan. Nilanthan, we were speaking about Sri Lanka picking a side, if ever it comes to the eventuality where we have to pick a side. And you said there are only two real sides that are seen right now. You have the Chinese bloc and you have the Western bloc along with India. Nilanthan, now you said you were speaking about how we need to look at how people connect, the synergy we have with the civilizations in the Western bloc, and if we do share the same thing in China. But picking a side, does it really mean that we have to, exclude a majority at least of relations with the other side? How have the other countries fared that? You said certain countries that have picked a side, have they completely cut off relations with the other bloc?
No, not at all, not at all. In fact, the irony is that the two biggest trading partners in the world are the United States and China, right? So here we are discussing sort of the satellite states of that rivalry when the two of them are the world's biggest business partners. So it certainly doesn't mean that we have to shun the other side. But as you pointed out in that question, which is what my answer was a response to, there will be moments where we might have to pick. And that was the sort of scenario under which we were going through these different possibilities. If we had to pick, we might not always have to pick. There might, out of 1,000 instances, there might only be 1 or 2 instances where we actually have to pick a side. But we will still get 1 or 2 instances where we have to pick a side. So it's only during those moments that these calculations will come into play. But as you pointed out, that doesn't mean that our regular status of friendship will have to change in terms of doing business, in terms of making deals, in terms of cooperating with each other, not at all.
Nilanthan, you said that more democratic countries gets involved in internal affairs of, well, at least Sri Lanka, including human rights, standards, and various other matters that are usually or traditionally were in the scope of the administration of that specific country. However, diplomacy has evolved throughout the years, and this has kind of become the new norm of diplomacy, where human rights takes center stage in everything that's taking place in the world. However, with the evolution of democracy, there were some instances in the past here in Sri Lanka where the Chinese embassy were involved in local matters, specifically regarding the fertilizer that was brought into Sri Lanka from China and then rejected because the Sri Lanka Plant Quarantine Service said that they found a harmful bacteria in this stock of fertilizer. However, now this the company involved in this matter was a private company in China. It's a commercial entity in China, at least, and the Chinese embassy here in Sri Lanka put out a statement saying that the plant quarantine service, the National Plant Quarantine Service in Sri Lanka, has gotten this wrong. This is against international standards, and therefore this report cannot be accepted. Is this normal for a diplomatic mission to issue statements like this, questioning the integrity of local institutions, local standard institutions? Is this normal?
So as in, it's not normal in terms of sort of global standards, in terms of how things are done. However, we have to remember that the nature of Chinese engagement with the world, of which Sri Lanka is a part, is in terms of sort of engaging with them through these public-private ventures. So, for instance, China has been very vocal in terms of defending pipeline construction companies in Central Asia, in terms of defending private Chinese business interests in, let's say, Central and Western Africa. So, because China's engagement with the world is so based on not only the Chinese state being a partner, but also in bringing in private entities. And let's face it, these private entities are, quote unquote, public entities as well. It's China, right? So even in terms of the private sector itself, there are certain sort of allegiances and relationships they have with the Chinese government. So it's not private sector in the sense that we would describe a private sector company here that might have absolutely nothing to do with the government at all. So in that sense, yes, as you pointed out, it might not be the norm. However, China's engagement with the world works outside of the norm as well. And that is the rationale behind the Chinese embassy putting out that message. It wasn't anything specific to Sri Lanka. It's simply a part of how they see Chinese interests all over the world. They would have done it even if it was some other country. It's not that they kind of did it because they were here. So, something like this happens in another country that they're deeply engaged in, they would have said the same thing.
Now, the opposition is speaking of a possibility where this fertilizer that the National Plant Quarantine Service rejected is somehow going to be forcibly sent back to Sri Lanka, and where the Sri Lankan government is pushed against the wall and, forced to give this to our farmers. Now, I know it's quite unlikely of us as non-agricultural experts to discuss the consequences of this matter, but diplomatically, is that a possibility? Does Chinese diplomatic services, since you said it operates outside the norm, I'm just trying to think out of the box, is this a possibility?
So it would all depend on the leadership of that individual country that China is dealing with. So, for example, if China is dealing with, once again, we can just use Sri Lanka as an example here, but this is how China deals with everybody. So we shouldn't fall into the trap of assuming that this is some problem unique to us. There's an issue everywhere. So in terms of something like that happening, it would all depend on whether the local leadership there would agree to that. So as you were saying, I am neither an agricultural expert nor am I an expert on local politics. So diplomatically, they can try to strong arm us if they want to, but I don't really see that being very likely. That wouldn't be China's style. Once there's an issue that's really become controversial in a particular country, the Chinese typically try to put out the fire rather than to kind of fan the flames, so to speak.
Nilanthan, another issue that was widely discussed here in Sri Lanka was the provincial council elections. Now, many Sri Lankans know the history of the provincial councils and how they came to be here in Sri Lanka. It was India that directly got involved as a solution to the ethnic issue in Sri Lanka at the time. And through the Indo-Sri Lanka agreement, we had a huge court battle here as to whether or not the 13th Amendment can be introduced. However, finally it was introduced, and now we've been having the 13th Amendment and provincial councils in our country for quite a long time. But for the past 4 to 5 years, we've hit a stone wall. The elections have not been held, the tenure of these provincial councils have expired, however the country goes on. But now all of a sudden, there is a renewed effort to hold the provincial council elections. Of course, it is only legal and right to hold the provincial council elections, as it is a part of our constitution, but there were allegations leveled by the opposition that, like you said, China might try to strong-arm us diplomatically on the fertilizer issue. In this matter, India is trying to strong-arm us, saying, we'll give you a loan for fuel until January, hold the provincial council elections. What is your take on that?
I mean, so this is not the type of story that's new, to be honest. There have always been theories on why this happened or why that happened, why didn't this happen, and all that. To be completely honest with you, I am not qualified to comment on that particular issue because, as you were saying, there are claims made by the opposition. The government has a certain sort of position to defend against those claims. So in terms of that debate, I don't see debates like that going down, regardless of what the geopolitical situation. So there are political experts and there are geopolitical experts. I would consider myself a part of the latter. I wish I had a more interesting answer for you, but it's not my area of expertise.
But judging by the relations that Sri Lanka and India have had, India had their policy of neighbor first. So Sri Lanka has been a very close partner with India. Would it be normal for India to maybe try to strong-arm us and get the provincial council elections through?
Not particularly, as in if you look at India's typical style of strong-arming neighbors, firstly, India is trying to come out of that traditional style of diplomacy. That needs to be acknowledged as well. So it would be a bit of a trap for us to fall into if we were to judge Narendra Modi's foreign policy based on the foreign policy of his predecessors. So, but even then, based on India's traditional style of interference, as you put it, with the affairs of other countries and strong arming and all that, I don't particularly see them being able to do something explicit like that. If at all they do interfere, it will be something far more subtle. It will not be overt things that people might be able to read on WhatsApp and Facebook and things like that. It would be something much more subtle, done behind the scenes.
Also, Niruthan, one final question. Sri Lanka is caught up in the middle of this geopolitical struggle. And you were saying that Sri Lanka is trying to still hold on to its policy of non-alignment. However, there are now more than just two global powers. There are many countries that are capable of, that have nuclear capabilities, and there are many other countries that are rising to that status, of course, because of the arms race that is going round. In the event of the emergence of multiple global powers, which is already taking place, we have Russia coming up again, then we have countries like Japan also raising their status. In a world that is not bipolar, how should Sri Lanka move forward?
So the great science fiction writer Robert Heinlein, one of the great science fiction writers of the 20th century, has a great quote where he said, "An armed society is a polite society." And similarly, a world with many, many different powers could in many ways be a more stable world than what we've seen under one particular power or a bipolar world like the Cold War was. So in that sense, there are many opportunities for Sri Lanka to exploit on, where we can deal with many different countries. So even when we look at regions, Southeast Asia, South America, West Africa, these are all regions that are in a kind of state of economic transformation at the moment. Central Asia, my God, all those Central Asian countries are now finally coming into their own and forming their own economic and political identity. So we are kind of a small piece of the jigsaw puzzle, but we are an important piece of the jigsaw puzzle. So as long as we don't really try to go beyond our means, and as long as we have a very clear understanding of what our role is civilizationally in the world, of what our role is strategically in geopolitics, we will be fine. We just need to make on a tiny boat sailing through a minefield. So as long as we sail carefully, we should be fine.
Thank you very much, Nilanthan Niruthan. Very eloquently put that last bit, for sure. Thank you very much for joining us on our show, and I'm pretty sure if our viewers understood you as much as I did, it would have been an amazing show. Thank you very much, Nilanthan, for joining us and clarifying these matters, of course, of quite complexity, and well, bringing them down to comprehensively make us, well, the general public, understand of what the real situation in the global arena is. Thank you very much, Nilanthan.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and thank you for a very generous interview.
And also a big thank you to all our viewers out there for tuning in to Newsline. As usual, we will see you again, same time, same place tomorrow. Until then, take care and God bless.